There are encounters that change everything, moments when two opposing worlds collide with the force of a tectonic shift. It's what happens when innocence confronts cruelty, when a single child dares to challenge an empire built on contempt. On that day, on the sprawling grounds of one of America's greatest fortunes, a ruthless billionaire erupted in a cruel, booming laugh upon hearing an 8-year-old boy claim he could heal him. The man, Julian Croft, who had funneled millions into the hands of the world's most brilliant medical minds, scoffed with all the disdain he could muster, humiliating the small, poorly dressed child who dared to defy science. But the boy's calm, unwavering response would change everything forever. Julian Croft had everything money could buy, except for one thing: the ability to walk. At 52, he commanded a multi-billion-dollar tech and finance empire from the confines of a state-of-the-art wheelchair, a reality that only sharpened the edges of his bitterness. His 300-acre estate in the Hamptons was more than a home. It was a monument to his power and a fortress built from his scorn for humanity. That crisp September morning, Julian was in his glass-walled office, firing another employee. The head gardener, a man who had served him for 2 decades, had committed the unforgivable sin of treading on the freshly manicured lawn with muddy shoes. "You're pathetic," Julian spat, his voice laced with venom. 20 years on this property and you still haven't learned that perfection isn't an option here. It's the baseline. You're fired. Don't expect a reference. The 60-year-old man pleaded, mentioning his grandchildren, his wife's mounting medical bills. But Julian merely offered a cold, thin smile. "You should have thought of that before you defiled my grass. Marcus, escort this man off the premises." This was how Julian Croft lived, by wielding absolute power over the lives of others, finding a sadistic pleasure in their humiliation. His employees feared him. His business partners respected him out of that same fear, and he fed on the terror he inspired. After the gardener was unceremoniously removed, Julian turned his attention to the mountain of medical reports on his desk. 5 years. 5 years since the high-speed car crash that had severed his connection to the lower half of his body. 5 years of hemorrhaging a fortune on the world's top doctors, chasing a cure that remained a mirage. "Dr. Harrison is calling from London," announced Amelia, his executive assistant of 15 years, her voice as sterile as the office itself. "The results from the experimental trials are in." Julian snatched the phone, a flicker of hope warring with his ingrained cynicism. As always, the conversation ended in a storm of frustration. Another failed attempt, millions more down the drain. The English doctor, one of the world's leading neurologists, confirmed what every other expert had already concluded. There was no known cure for his specific spinal cord injury. "Incompetent fools," Julian muttered, slamming the phone down so hard it cracked the receiver. All of them, decades of study, walls lined with diplomas, and not one of them can do the one thing I pay them to do. It was then that Marcus, his head of security, entered the office, a rare look of confusion on his stoic face. "Mr. Croft, there's a child at the main gate. A young boy, couldn't be more than 8. He says he needs to speak with you." Julian let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "A child? What could a child possibly want with me? Must be some local beggar. Send him away." "I've tried, sir," Marcus replied, shifting his weight. "He's insistent. He says, well, this is going to sound strange. He says he can heal you." The silence that followed was heavy, thick with disbelief. Julian stared at Marcus as if he had sprouted a second head. "He said what?" "That he can heal your legs, sir. I know it sounds insane, but the kid seems determined. He's been standing out there for 2 hours in the sun, just waiting." A strange cocktail of fury and morbid curiosity stirred within Julian. How dare some child show up at his fortress, making such an absurd, impossible claim? Yet there was something about the sheer audacity of it that sparked his sadistic interest. Perhaps it was an opportunity for some cruel amusement. "Bring him to me," Julian commanded, a wicked smile spreading across his face. "Let's see what kind of circus act this child has to offer." 15 minutes later, Marcus returned, followed by the most resolute-looking boy Julian had ever seen. Leo was small for his 8 years, dressed in simple but clean clothes, with eyes that shone with a confidence that was utterly out of place. He showed no hint of intimidation, not by the cavernous grandeur of the mansion, nor by the imposing, scowling figure of Julian Croft himself. "So you're the boy who thinks he can heal me," Julian began, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Do you have any idea how many doctors, how many specialists, how many certified geniuses of medicine have already tried and failed to do exactly that?" Leo looked directly into Julian's eyes, without fear, without hesitation. "I can heal your legs," he said, his voice clear and simple. The laugh that erupted from Julian Croft echoed through the vast office. It was a harsh, ugly sound, full of derision and malice. "You can heal me? You?" Julian slammed his hands on the polished mahogany of his desk, still chuckling. "Kid, I have spent over $40 million on the best medical minds on this planet. I've been to the Mayo Clinic, to Johns Hopkins, to Mount Sinai. I've flown in specialists from Switzerland, Germany, and Japan, and you, a poor kid who's probably never set foot in a decent school, think you can do what they couldn't." Leo remained perfectly still, his expression serene. "The doctors work with what they know," the boy replied calmly. "I work with what they don't." Julian's laughter died in his throat. There was something in the boy's unnerving calm that deeply irritated him. "You know what, kid? You amuse me, so I'll make you a proposition." Julian leaned forward, his eyes glinting with malice. "If you can heal me, if you can make me walk again, I will give you $1 million. $1 million. Enough money for you and your family to escape whatever miserable hole you crawled out of. But," and here Julian's cruel smile widened, "when you fail, and you will fail, I want you to walk out of here knowing you wasted my time with your childish fantasies. I want you to learn that there's a hard line between what people like you can dream and what people like me can buy." Leo simply nodded. "Get the check ready," the boy said, with a confidence that sent a strange, unfamiliar shiver down Julian's spine. For a moment, just a fleeting moment, Julian Croft felt something he hadn't felt in years: uncertainty. He quickly crushed the feeling. It was impossible. Utterly impossible. This boy was just another dreamer, about to learn a very hard lesson about reality. Julian decided this absurd situation deserved his full, undivided attention. It had been a long time since he'd had this much fun at someone else's expense, and the arrogant innocence of this boy promised a full afternoon of sadistic entertainment. "Amelia, cancel all my afternoon appointments," he ordered, his eyes never leaving Leo. "I want ample time to watch this spectacle unfold." The billionaire wheeled his chair closer to the boy, studying him like a predator examining its prey. "Before we begin this little farce, kid, let me educate you on the reality of my situation. Perhaps then you'll grasp the sheer magnitude of your own ignorance." Julian pressed a button on a remote, and a massive screen descended silently from the ceiling. A slideshow of medical imagery began to play. X-rays, MRI scans, complex charts filled with numbers and incomprehensible medical terminology. "This, right here," Julian said, gesturing to the images, "is the work of the greatest minds in modern medicine. Dr. Michael Harrison of London, the man who revolutionized spinal neurology. Dr. Sarah Chen from Singapore, a pioneer in regenerative therapies. Dr. Klaus Weber from Germany, the creator of the most advanced neural reconstruction techniques." Leo stood in silence, observing the images without a flicker of intimidation. "Every single one of these doctors," Julian continued, his voice rising with theatrical intensity, "has decades of study, thousands of successful surgeries, international awards. They have examined every nerve, every vertebra, every conceivable possibility of recovery in my body. And do you know what every single one of them told me? Julian paused for dramatic effect, savoring the moment. That there is no cure, that the lesion on my spinal cord is irreversible, that all the science in the world cannot undo what was done to me. Now you tell me, little boy, what qualification do you possess that these giants of medicine do not? Leo finally spoke, his quiet voice cutting through Julian's arrogance like a razor. They look at what is broken. I see what can be mended. The simplicity of the answer infuriated Julian. How dare this child speak of medicine with such confidence? How dare he challenge decades of scientific knowledge with phrases that sounded like cheap fortune cookie wisdom? That's not an answer. That's bad poetry, Julian exploded. Medicine is science, kid. It's tests, diagnostics, proven treatments. It's not pretty sentences spoken by children who probably can't even read properly. But Leo remained unperturbed. He walked over to one of the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out at the perfectly manicured gardens. How many years have you been in this chair? The boy asked. 5, Julian answered, suspicious. Why? And in 5 years, how many times have you tried to stand up? Julian laughed with disdain. Tried to stand up? That's ridiculous. My spinal cord is severed. Trying to stand up would be like trying to fly. It's physically impossible. You gave up before you even tried, Leo observed, turning to face the billionaire. The doctors told you it was impossible, and you believed them. You stopped fighting. The rage that erupted in Julian was instantaneous and volcanic. Gave up, he screamed, his knuckles white as he gripped the arms of his chair. I spent $40 million trying to get better. I underwent 17 experimental surgeries. I tested drugs that haven't even been approved by the FDA. I endured therapies that lasted for months, treatments that brought me closer to death than to a cure. And you have the audacity to stand there and tell me I gave up? Amelia appeared at the door, alarmed by the shouting, but Julian waved her away with a furious gesture. You know the difference between you and me, kid? Julian continued, his voice now dangerously low. I have power. I have money. I have access to the absolute best the world has to offer. You have nothing. You live in a house that's probably worth less than what I spend on shoes in a month. You've never set foot in a university, never read a medical textbook, never even seen the inside of a real hospital. Julian hit the remote again. The screen now showed glossy photos of luxurious hospital suites, futuristic medical equipment, and labs that looked like something out of a sci-fi movie. This is the Mayo Clinic, where I spent 3 months. It cost $2.5 million. This is Johns Hopkins, another $4 million. Mount Sinai, 3.8. Have you ever even seen that much money in your life, boy? Leo shook his head, but he didn't seem the least bit intimidated by the ostentatious display of wealth. And yet, the boy said, his voice steady, you're still in the chair. The silence that followed was tense and suffocating. Julian felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. The boy's simple, direct observation had sliced through all his financial and medical armor, exposing the raw, naked truth he so desperately tried to avoid. For all his money and all his power, he was still a broken man. That's different, Julian mumbled, but his voice had lost its commanding force. Is it? Leo asked, taking a step toward the wheelchair. You spent millions trying to fix what's broken. I can heal what never stopped working. That makes no sense. Neurologically speaking, it's impossible. You trust the doctors more than you trust yourself, Leo interrupted. They told you there was no hope, so you stopped hoping. They told you there was no cure, so you stopped believing you could be healed. Julian felt a strange stirring in his chest. It was as if Leo's words were awakening something that had been buried for years, under layers of bitterness and disillusionment. You don't understand, Julian said, his voice less certain now. Modern medicine is precise. There are physical limits that cannot be surpassed. My body was examined by the best. And what if the best are wrong? Leo asked, his eyes meeting Julian's with a disturbing intensity. For the first time in 5 years, Julian Croft didn't have an immediate cutting retort. And that scared him more than he was willing to admit. Julian couldn't get Leo's question out of his head. All night, the words, "What if the best are wrong?" echoed in his mind like a hammer striking an anvil. By morning, his irritation had curdled into something approaching outright fury. "Amelia!" he yelled as soon as he was awake. "Get that boy back here, now!" An hour later, Leo was once again in the office, possessing the same unshakable calm as the day before. Julian had spent the pre-dawn hours preparing what he considered his definitive arsenal against the child's infuriating arrogance. "Sit down," Julian ordered, pointing to a leather chair opposite his desk. "Yesterday, you planted a ridiculous seed of doubt in my mind. Today, I'm going to rip it out by the roots." Julian activated a series of remotes, and the office transformed into a medical lecture hall. Screens descended, projectors whirred to life, and suddenly the room was filled with medical degrees, certifications, and peer-reviewed articles. "This," Julian said with a sweeping gesture, "is the irrefutable proof that you are nothing more than a delusional child with fantasies of miracle cures." The first screen displayed a diploma framed in gold. Dr. Richard Kellerman, Harvard Medical School, summa cum laude, advanced neurosurgery. "Dr. Kellerman," Julian announced with exaggerated reverence, "spent 17 years studying cases just like mine. 17 years. He's written 43 scientific papers on spinal cord injuries, revolutionized 3 surgical techniques, and saved over 2,000 patients. When he examined me for 8 straight hours and told me there was no hope, do you think he was lying?" Leo observed the display in silence, showing no signs of being impressed. Julian switched to the next screen. Dr. Elena Volkov, Moscow Institute of Advanced Medicine. She developed the world's most advanced stem cell therapy. She tested it on me for 6 months. It cost $12 million. The result? 0. Nothing. Do you think you know more than her? One after another, Julian paraded the credentials of the world's medical elite. Dr. Kenji Tanaka from Tokyo, a global expert in neural regeneration. Dr. François Dubois from Paris, a pioneer in spinal implants. Dr. Antonio Rossi from Milan, creator of the most sophisticated vertebral reconstruction technique in Europe. "Experts," Julian declared, his voice booming. 23 of the finest medical brains on the planet. Some have won Nobel Prizes. Others have created techniques that have saved thousands of lives, and every single one of them reached the exact same conclusion. Julian Croft will never walk again. He paused, breathing heavily, as if he'd just run a marathon. "And now," he said, his voice dripping with venom, "an 8-year-old boy shows up, illiterate, I'm sure, and certainly ignorant of any basic concept of anatomy, and tells me he can do what these giants could not. Does that really make any sense to you?" Leo remained silent for a few moments, taking in all the medical imagery surrounding him. When he finally spoke, his voice was even calmer than before. "You put a lot of trust in those papers." "Papers?" Julian exploded. "Those are degrees from Harvard, Oxford, the Sorbonne. They are international certifications, acknowledgements of medical excellence. Those papers represent the pinnacle of centuries of scientific knowledge. And yet," Leo said, rising from his chair, "you're still sitting." The brutal simplicity of the observation struck Julian like a physical blow. He looked around at the screens filled with diplomas and accolades, at all the evidence of medical superiority he had gathered. And the inescapable reality remained. He was still trapped in that chair. That's different," Julian stammered. "Medicine has its limits. There are cases that are genuinely untreatable." "For them," Leo said, gesturing toward the images of the doctors. "Not for me." Julian felt a toxic mix of rage and something else he couldn't quite identify. Maybe it was fear. Fear that a child could be right where the world's best were wrong. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he yelled. "These men and women dedicated their entire lives to medicine. They have equipment that costs millions of dollars, and you're telling me that with your two empty hands, you can do better. Leo walked over to a screen displaying an MRI of Julian's spine. He studied the image for a moment, then turned to the billionaire. "Do you see this scan?" he asked, pointing. "Of course I see it. It's my spine. It cost $15,000 to get that scan on the best machine in New York. And what do you see when you look at it?" Julian frowned, confused by the question. "I see the lesion on my spinal cord. I see the damage that left me paralyzed. I see the scientific proof that I cannot walk." Leo nodded slowly. "You only see what's broken. That's why you stay broken." "That makes no medical sense," Julian protested, but his voice had lost some of its conviction. "It doesn't have to make sense to them," Leo said, gesturing to the images of the doctors. "It has to make sense to you." For the first time, Julian found himself without an immediate comeback. He looked again at all the diplomas, all the certificates, all the evidence of medical superiority he had amassed. And for the first time in 5 years, a tiny voice in his mind whispered the question he had refused to consider. What if all of this is wrong? A week had passed since Leo had touched his knee, and Julian hadn't slept a single full night. That bizarre sensation, that impossible awareness that something had touched his leg, would not leave his mind. He had tried to rationalize it, to explain it away scientifically, even to lie to himself and say he had imagined it all. But the truth remained lodged in his consciousness. For a split second, he had felt something. That morning, Julian made the most terrifying decision of his life. He dismissed every staff member from the mansion, cancelled all his meetings, and sent Amelia home for the week. He wanted to be completely alone with Leo when he attempted the impossible. "Are you sure about this, sir?" Marcus, his head of security, had asked before leaving. "Alone with the boy?" "I'm sure," Julian had replied, though his voice trembled slightly. "And Marcus, I don't want to be disturbed by anything or anyone." When Leo arrived at noon, he found Julian in the center of the cavernous office, away from his desk, away from the screens, away from everything that represented his identity as a rich and powerful man. He was just there, in his wheelchair, looking as vulnerable and frightened as a child. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said," Julian began, his voice quieter than usual. "About talking to my legs. About things medicine doesn't understand. About hope." Leo nodded silently, respecting the immense difficulty of this moment for the billionaire. "For 5 years," Julian continued, "I have relied completely on science. When the doctors said it was impossible, I accepted it as absolute truth. I stopped trying, I stopped believing, I stopped living, really." Julian looked down at his hands, avoiding Leo's gaze. "But you asked me a question I can't get out of my head. What if the best are wrong? What if there's something they don't understand? What if—" He swallowed hard. "What if I've wasted 5 years of my life believing a lie?" "You didn't waste anything," Leo said softly. "You needed this time to get here, to be ready." "Ready for what?" "To truly try." Julian closed his eyes for a moment, taking a deep breath. When he opened them, there was a resolve in them that hadn't been there for years. "What do you need me to do?" Leo walked until he was standing directly in front of Julian's chair. "First, you need to stop thinking like a patient." "What do you mean?" "Patients are sick people, waiting for others to cure them. You're not a patient. You're a person who has forgotten how to use a part of his body." Julian felt a subtle shift in his perception. It was as if Leo had refocused a camera lens, and suddenly he was seeing the same situation from a completely different angle. "Now," Leo said, "I want you to close your eyes and remember the last time you walked." "That's going to hurt," Julian murmured, but he closed his eyes anyway. "Remember what it felt like. Not the accident, not the pain. Remember the feeling of standing, of taking a step, of feeling the ground beneath your feet." Julian forced himself back in time, before the crash, before the chair, before the bitterness. He remembered walking through the gardens of his estate, climbing the stairs in his city penthouse, feeling the solid earth under his feet. "Can you feel it?" Leo asked. "I can remember it," Julian answered, his voice thick with emotion. "Don't remember, feel it. Now." Julian frowned, concentrating intensely, and then something impossible happened. For a fleeting moment, he felt as if his feet were touching the floor, not physically, but in some deeper, more profound way that felt more real than physical reality itself. I felt something," he whispered, his eyes flying open in shock. "Now," Leo said, placing his hands on Julian's shoulders, "talk to your legs." That's absurd." "Do it anyway." Julian hesitated, feeling ridiculous, but he had come too far to turn back now. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "Tell them you miss them. Tell them you want them to work again. Tell them you need them." Julian looked down at his motionless legs. For 5 years he had seen them as dead parts of his body, as evidence of his failure. Now, for the first time, he tried to see them as Leo suggested, as a part of himself that had simply forgotten how to function. I miss you," Julian said, his voice cracking with emotion. "I miss walking. I miss standing. I miss being whole." Tears began to stream down his face, years of pent-up pain and frustration finally finding an escape. "I need you," he continued, now speaking directly to his legs. "I need to be who I was again. Forgive me for giving up on you. Forgive me for stopping believing." David kept his hands on Julian's shoulders, and the billionaire could feel a strange energy emanating from the boy. It was nothing that could be measured or explained scientifically, but it was real, more real than any medical scan he had ever undergone. "Now," Leo said, his voice almost a whisper, "try to stand up." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. "I can't. It's physically impossible." "Forget what's physically possible. Just try." Julian placed his hands on the arms of his chair, as he had tried to do thousands of times over the past 5 years. But this time was different. This time, he wasn't trying to prove he could walk. He was trying to remember how to walk. He pushed with his arms, straining to lift himself. Nothing happened as usual. But then Leo placed a hand on Julian's chest, right over his heart. "Don't just use your arms," the boy said. "Use everything. Use the anger you felt for 5 years. Use the pain of being betrayed by your own body. Use the hope you've been hiding. Use it all." Julian closed his eyes again, and for the first time in 5 years, he tried to stand with every fiber of his being, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually, with all the willpower he had amassed through years of frustration. And then something miraculous happened. His legs trembled. Julian's eyes shot open wide with shock. Leo smiled for the first time since they had met. "Again," the boy said. "Stronger." Julian took a deep breath and tried again. This time, as his legs trembled, he felt a strange sensation shoot up his spine, like long dormant electrical circuits were being reconnected. "This is impossible," Julian murmured. But there was real hope in his voice for the first time in years. "For whom?" Leo asked, echoing the question that had haunted Julian. And Julian Croft, for the first time in 5 years, didn't have an answer based on medical limitations. He only had a growing feeling that the impossible was about to become reality. The tremors in his legs intensified. They weren't involuntary spasms. They were conscious movements, as if his muscles were awakening from a deep 5-year slumber. The billionaire stared at his own legs with a mixture of terror and awe. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, not denial. 5 years. I believed. You believed what you needed to believe at the time," Leo said softly. "But you don't need to anymore." Julian pushed himself up again, this time with a confidence he hadn't felt in half a decade. He braced himself on the arms of the chair and slowly, painstakingly, began to transfer his weight onto his legs. They shook under the pressure, unstable after so long, but they held. They responded. "They're responding," Julian whispered, tears of disbelief and joy streaming down his face. My God, they're actually responding. With Leo offering a steadying hand, Julian managed to push himself partially out of the chair. His legs were wobbly, barely able to support him, but they were working. For the first time in 5 years, Julian Croft was on his feet. I don't believe it, he said, his voice breaking. $40 million in medical treatments, the best specialists in the world, and an 8-year-old boy did what they all said was impossible. He sank back into the chair, exhausted but radiant. He looked at Leo with an expression completely transformed from all the days before. There was no contempt, no arrogance. There was only gratitude, awe, and something he hadn't felt in decades. Humility. How? Julian asked. How did you know it was possible when every doctor said it wasn't? Leo sat in the chair opposite the billionaire, looking both younger and infinitely wiser. The doctors look at what's broken and try to fix it. I look for what never stopped working and help it remember. But how did you learn this? Where did you study? Who taught you? Leo's smile was tinged with sadness. My mother was very sick. The doctors said she was going to die. She didn't die because I learned that sometimes the body just needs to remember how to be healthy again. Julian felt a pang in his chest. He had spent the week questioning Leo's qualifications, scorning his humble origins, only to discover the boy had developed this extraordinary gift, trying to save his own mother. Your mother? Was she cured? She was, Leo replied. But the doctors called it a fluke. They said there was no scientific explanation. So she started to believe them, instead of believing what had happened. Julian understood the tragedy implicit in the answer. Leo's mother had been healed, but had chosen to trust the science of limitations over the miracle she had lived. And you? Julian asked. Why did you decide to help me? Leo was silent for a moment, choosing his words carefully. Because you were like she was, sick not just in your body but in your heart. You lost hope. You lost faith in yourself. You lost the ability to believe you could be whole again. Leo's words struck Julian with the force of a revelation. He had spent 5 years focused solely on his physical paralysis, never realizing that the true disease was the emotional and spiritual paralysis that had taken root in his life. $1 million, Julian said suddenly, remembering the mocking promise he had made. You really did it. The money is yours. Leo shook his head. I don't want your money. Julian was stunned. But you healed me. You did the impossible. $1 million is the least I can... You still don't understand, Leo interrupted gently. The healing wasn't what happened to your legs. The healing was what happened to your heart. Julian paused, processing the words. It was true. Yes, his legs were working again, but the most profound change had occurred somewhere else entirely. For the first time in decades, he felt human, connected to something greater than his own power and wealth. Then what do you want? Julian asked. I want you to remember what you learned here, Leo said, standing to leave. I want you to remember that sometimes the answers aren't in the most expensive books or the most luxurious clinics. Sometimes they're in places we never thought to look. Leo walked toward the door, but Julian called out, Wait, where are you going? How can I find you? How can I thank you properly? Leo turned one last time, that serene smile on his face. You don't need to find me. You just need to remember not to give up on people that others have already given up on. Remember that everyone deserves a second chance, even you. And with that, Leo walked out of the office, leaving Julian Croft alone with his working legs and a heart that had rediscovered its capacity for gratitude. 3 months had passed. The transformation in Julian Croft was so radical that those closest to him could barely recognize the man he had become. He rehired every employee he had unjustly fired, including the elderly gardener, not just with their old jobs, but with significant raises and a comprehensive health plan for their families. He began to overhaul his ruthless business practices, turning hostile takeovers into partnership offers. But the most significant change was personal. He had spent decades building walls. Now he was learning to build bridges. 6 months after his encounter with Leo, Julian received a call from the head of pediatric neurology at a Manhattan Children's Hospital. A young girl was suffering from a rare neurological condition, and the parents, having heard a rumor about Julian's unconventional recovery, were desperate. Julian felt his heart race. This was his chance. "Tell the parents I'll be there in an hour," he said. "And doctor, sometimes the answers are in places traditional medicine doesn't look. Keep an open mind." When he arrived, he found a family shattered by grief. He knelt before the little girl who reminded him so painfully of Leo. "I can't promise a cure," he said, his voice gentle, "but I can promise we won't give up, and I can teach you something I learned. Sometimes the healing begins when we stop accepting impossibility as the final answer." A year after meeting Leo, Julian Croft was a new man. He had established a foundation dedicated to helping families facing impossible diagnoses. He had reconnected with relatives he had alienated with his cruelty. He had learned to find joy in simple things, a sincere conversation, a thank you letter, the feeling of walking through his gardens, not as a king surveying his domain, but as a man grateful to be alive. He never saw Leo again, but he carried the boy's lesson with him always. The true cure doesn't happen in the body, but in the heart. Julian Croft had been offered $1 million for a cure. In the end, he received something far more valuable, a second chance to be human. And this time, he wouldn't waste it. The man who once mocked a child's hope now spent his life planting seeds of hope in hearts that had given up. And in every life he touched, he kept alive the memory of the boy who taught him that the greatest miracles happen when we stop believing in limitations and start believing in possibilities.